So we shall start in a minute or so, and let's see how many people have joined us so far. With live viewers, can't see any live viewers as yet. Okay, so there are 45 live viewers. Okay, so I think we can start. So a very warm welcome to you, Samir, Professor Samir Khan. He is Associate Professor at Reed College, Portland. And thank you very much for accepting our invite to be the inaugural speaker of our IndoPhon talk series. And also for all the other people who are watching this broadcast, a warm welcome to all of you as well to this talk on intonation model that Samir has developed for South Asian languages. And before we begin, I would also like to say a few words about this group, IndoPhon. So we are a speech-related research community. So for a long time, we thought that speech-related research in Indian linguistics lacked a formal community dedicated to its development. So, and there were limited resources, lack of access to data, and given the pandemic, we thought that we have in our hands a situation where we can at least form a group and start collaborating with people across the world and see what they are doing. And although that was just an opportunity, our long-term goal is to address a lot of questions related to phonetics, phonology, speech, and we also want to initiate and further diverse conversations within phonetics and phonology, not just in India and also beyond. So at the moment, we are a group of small group of phoneticians and phonologists in India, but we hope to build a bigger collective. So. So we have with us, we are 5 members. So I'm Shakuntala Mahanta at IIT Guwahati. We have Professor Indranil Datta at Jadavpur University. And we have Professor Somdev Kar at IIT Ropar. We have Amalesh Kope at Tejpur University. And we also have Professor Rinu Punos at IIT Palakkad. So this is about us. So now the stage is yours, Samir. So I will let you speak and present your talk. So yeah, here you go.
Thank you so much, Shakuntala, and thank you to everyone who's been organizing IndoPhon. So Shakuntala, Indranil, Shomdeb, Amalesh, and Renu. Thank you for inviting me to be the inaugural speaker of the inaugural meeting of IndoPhon. It's quite an honor, and I'm very excited. You've put really an exciting lineup of talks together. So thank you for organizing this. I'm gonna go ahead and switch to sharing my screen, or I'm not sure if that's also already visible. Okay, great. Today, I want to talk to you all about my intonational model for South Asian languages, as Shakuntala said. And the work that I'm going to talk about is still in progress. It's not something that I have firm conclusions on, but I just want to kind of get this idea out there and see if I can get collaboration through this kind of platform and elsewhere. I like to start talking about talking about how, of course, there's quite a lot of diversity of languages in South Asia with lots of different language families represented. But we know from all kinds of different phenomena that even within such a diverse area, we're really looking at a region of convergence. And we know that South Asia is known as a linguistic area in the sense that even across language families, we see a lot of similarities across South Asian languages. The typical, quote unquote, South Asian language would have retroflex consonants, would probably not have inflectional prefixes, would probably mark their experiencer subjects with some kind of case other than nominative. But even when we look at these kinds of kind of cross-linguistic comparative phenomena, we would want to point out also some exceptions and also some regional patterns. For example, we know that retroflexes are fairly common across all the different language families of South Asia, except in the Tibeto-Burman language family, it's not that common, as well as in Assamese within Indo-Aryan. We also know that inflectional prefixes, while not really a thing within modern South Asian languages in general, they're very common in the Cossack family. And when we look at the experiencer subjects with non-nominative case, we'd want to think about, well, what case is actually used for such subjects? So if we were to look on this cute little map from Hans Hock's edited volume here, we'd want to think about how experiencer subjects are marked in different languages in South Asia. They're usually marked with dative case in the Munda languages, in the Dravidian languages, and in most of the Indo-Aryan languages. You would kind of convey a concept like I'm hungry, or I'm angry, or I'm afraid using dative marking. We could say that nominative case marking, which would be probably more common outside of South Asia, more universal, is also seen within a small group of South Asian languages, including the Cossack group and a lot of different Tibeto-Burman languages. We could say that maybe that's the atypical pattern for South Asia, but more typical elsewhere. But we would also want to find, would look for this kind of sub-pattern here in the eastern part of the subcontinent, where Bengali, Assamese, and Oriya in the Eastern Indo-Aryan group and various Tibeto-Burman languages in that same region, like Bodo and Kokborok, use the genitive marker for experiencer subjects. So I'm starting with this just to kind of think typologically, kind of think geographically, as well as in terms of families, and think about what makes for a typical South Asian language in terms of its intonation. I'd want to know what is the typical kind of South Asian language intonational structure, but also I would want to find out what are the areas of variation. So not just what's typical, but what are the exceptions within the languages that we're looking at, as well as whether there are some kind of regional or sub-regional commonalities between languages, even if it crosses language families. In terms of some kind of more general questions that I'm leading with, I want to know about what makes South Asia special. And one of the things that makes South Asia special in terms of intonation is its lack of contrastive tone or lack of contrastive stress in most of the different languages seen. And what does that mean in terms of the intonational system? Does that allow for kind of more freedom in the intonation to not have that kind of structuring property? And what are some kind of new phenomena that we see in South Asian languages that could contribute to our general understanding of intonational systems? So some of my goals for this talk will be, of course, to get you thinking about intonation in South Asia, but also to help build this corpus. I said it's still work in progress, and the corpus is now being expanded through socially distant methods. So you can be involved, and I'll tell you a little bit later about how. And I also want to kind of argue that South Asian languages are a really fascinating venue for exploring intonation. Now, you might want to know, are South Asian languages really actually interesting in their intonation? And if so, in what way? Well, the ways I would want to point out would be that South Asian languages have generally no audible stress. If there is something that we call stress in a South Asian language, it's usually very phonetically weak. It might have a predictable location. Maybe we'd want to kind of expand beyond that and think about a more general concept like just an accented syllable and not necessarily restrict it to something specific like phonetic stress. There's also not really any kind of lexical tone outside of the Tibeto-Burman family, as well as some of the Indo-Aryan languages in the north and the far east. But as a general pattern, lexical tone doesn't really appear through most of South Asia. So that might make you think that intonation in a South Asian language can kind of do whatever it wants. It doesn't have a lot structuring it in terms of stress and tone. Or it might mean that South Asian language intonation is just more structured around other kinds of structures. So maybe morphosyntactic structure, information structure, these types of things might have a greater role in determining where our tones go, our intonational tones go. Now, in terms of some work that's been done already in the past and is ongoing in in the literature, we see that those that have looked kind of across South Asian languages have noted that the intonation is strikingly uniform across languages, across families. Some have gone as far to even say that there are identical patterns and identical kinds of structures. At least in Caroline Ferry's 2010 model, we see that kind of the same model can be applied across Bengali, Hindi, Malayalam, and Tamil. In some later models, there's a little bit more variation, but still this general low-high repetitive rising contour is found across a lot of different South Asian languages. That's usually described as being, it's analyzed as every word kind of has a boundary tone on its left and a boundary tone on its right. The boundary tone on the left is a low tone and the boundary tone on the right is a high tone. And about every word or word-ish sized element forms its own unit. So you get this repetition of lows and highs that way. To kind of preview what I want to present here is that South Asian languages are a lot more complex than just that. There's going to be a typical kind of pattern that we see, but there's a lot more complexity and variability in terms of how this low-high contour actually gets manifested. So I'm trying to dig into this repetitive rising contour, the LH contour, specifically because it's a very pervasive pattern across languages, as well as in the studies of those languages. It seems to be kind of an area of focus. It's also an area where I can maybe do some analysis without necessarily having native intuition all the time. So it allows us to do kind of cross-linguistic work. Because this low-high rising pattern might be a little bit less prone to kind of discourse-related factors or information structure-related factors, whereas kind of larger boundary tones, so it's associated to overall sentences, can often have a lot more discourse or information structure-related information that I might not have native intuition or access to. And to preview kind of what I'm going to be showing, this low-high pattern is indeed very pervasive across South Asian languages, but we really need to interpret exactly what the low and the high are when we're talking about those. And we'll see that actually it's a lot more complex than two tones at the edges. And in fact, there are many other kinds of tones, other kinds of contours that are not rising that we can add to our inventory if we look across languages. All right, to give you kind of hint as to what this low-high pattern looks like if you haven't seen it before. Here's a sentence from Urdu representing this typical pattern that we see in the literature, where each word is about 2 or 3 syllables long, maybe even shorter, like a single syllable word, has a low on the left and a kind of high on the right. So each word has this little bit of a rising tone, and we can listen to this. Hopefully the audio will work. Now the speaker speaks rather quickly, so I'll just play it again, and I want you to listen to each of those different words, and you can hear that there's a kind of subtle rising pitch on each one. And in case you can't hear that well, you can also see it in the pitch track that the little blue line there is rising across each word, and it just falls between words kind of to connect these rises. And it doesn't seem to matter if we look at a 1-syllable word or 2-syllable word, we see that rise. But it's not necessarily super clear how that low-high contour should be analyzed. And I mean analyzed by linguists as well as how speakers are analyzing this. We could analyze it the way that Caroline Ferry and others do, as a low tone on the left edge and a high tone on the right edge. Or noticing that this word has an accented syllable at the beginning, maybe it's a low tone on the accented syllable and a high tone on the final syllable. Or maybe there's a low tone on the accented syllable and a high just has to come after it, but it doesn't have to be on the last syllable, it just has to be after the accented syllable. Or maybe we're actually looking at this backwards. The high should be on the right and it's aligned there, and a low just has to be somewhere before. Or maybe the low high is one kind of unit and anchored to the accented syllable. So obviously we need to look at different kinds of words. We want to expand the size of words, and we want to look at different accent patterns where the accented syllable is on a different part of the word. And this is often something that's left out in a lot of different types of studies. So that's something we're going to put some emphasis on. Some ways we might predict that there could be differences in interpretation. If we take that first interpretation where the low is on the left and the high is on the right, and it doesn't matter how long the word is or where the accent is, you'd get the first row here, where you see that a 3-syllabled word would have that same rising contour that we see in a 2-syllabled word. It's anchored on the 2 edges. That's why I've had the 2 edges shown in red to represent that that's all that kind of matters for determining that contour. And the position of the stress, the accent there doesn't really matter. If the accent does matter, then we could imagine that we'd get a different prediction for what the contour would look like if we move the accented syllable. And as you move further down, you can see even further changes would happen depending on the analysis. And these little images that I have on the right, don't worry, they're not going to disappear. I'm going to also repeat them on different slides where I'm showing images of examples that seem to exemplify these or illustrate these types of contours. So we'll see that all of these different interpretations might be valid across different languages. And even within languages, there could be alternative explanations for the contours we see. So the main type of data, the main patterns I'm going to be talking about will be what the alignment of the low tone is. I'm going to show that it is aligned to an accented syllable, and that the high tone at the end of the rise can be variable even within a language, whether it's at the end of the word or the phrase or within the word or the phrase, kind of closer to the accent. And then I'll point out some types of contours that are more complex than just a low-high, and then end with a little short note about how tones in at least one language can also be attracted to something else like length. The data that I'm going to be presenting all come from recordings of the North Wind and the Sun fable. The reason why I've chosen this particular fable is because it happens to already be translated in a lot of languages and recorded in a lot of languages, thanks to its use in the illustrations of the IPA, in the Journal of the IPA. So there are already many languages of South Asia that are recorded with this fable, and there are many more recordings in the UCLA archive of multiple speakers producing the same text. I've also recorded speakers myself at the Reed College Lab of Linguistics and added to, some more languages to the list that way. And most recently, I've kind of been contacting people to see if I can get socially distant self-recording. So we have translations now in Gujarati and Odia that are new as of just this month. There's also recordings of a children's picture book, Frog, Where Are You? If you're not familiar with this book has no words, it's all in pictures. So when people read it, there's a kind of obvious story involved, but there's nothing to read off exactly. So you can get a little bit more naturalistic speech. We're not going to see any data from that particular, those recordings today, just for the sake of time, but the patterns are very similar to what we see in the North Wind and the Sun fable. And there's also some more recordings from prosodic typology too, the edited volume by Sanajan. The languages we'll be looking at come from just 2 language families, but covering quite a wide geographical area. So we see multiple Indo-Aryan languages from Urdu and Sindhi in the far west, all the way to Assamese in the far northeast. And then we have 4 Dravidian languages as well. If you notice that your language is included on this list, you might want to have your voice added to the corpus. And so I would ask you to email me if you'd like to be a speaker. I would put my email address here, but since this is on YouTube, I figure it might be better for me to just say, Google my name, my full name, and you'll find my email address very easily. But email me, and then you can be part of the corpus for one of those languages. And if your language is not on here, then even better, you can be a language consultant and help with putting together materials, as well as helping with the analysis of the morphosyntax and kind of some intuitions of the materials. Anybody who participates as a participant or a consultant would be compensated for their time. So anyway, a little plug for that. So for consistency across languages, I'm showing all of these, all the data in a single kind of transcription system that I'm building called IntoSal, the International Transcription of South Asian Languages. It's a huge elaboration of what was just a model of Bangladeshi Bengali. It had to be changed a lot because obviously there's lots of different kinds of contours. And I'm using the edited volume Intonation and Romance as a kind of inspirational guide, because I find this a really useful volume. Intonation and Romance looks at lots of different Romance languages and finds and describes their very different intonations using the same kind of labels. And I find that very useful to kind of compare across languages with keeping the same labels in mind. So for those of you who haven't worked on intonation or aren't familiar with what our data looks like, or are interested in kind of doing this work on your own, I wanted to show how you put together a transcription of a South Asian language in terms of intonation. So you would want to, of course, have a recording of the utterance and a spectrogram with the pitch track, as well as some text grids that you can build in Prot with 4 different tiers. And I'm going to just show you the tiers so you don't have to read them off of here. But imagine you have this recording of Sindhi. This is from the JIPA entry on Sindhi. And you have this little piece that just means with that much more force. So let's listen to that. You'd want to listen to that a few times and kind of see what the pitch contour sounds like to you and how much it lines up with what you're seeing with a little blue line. And then you want to think, how would I label that if I just labeled low and high, wherever I hear a low or a high kind of turning point. And that's where we have the landmarks tier. And that's kind of specific to Intrasal and a few other kind of transcription systems where you have a sort of raw interpretation of the pitch contour in just low and high anchor points. And you just mark places where you think that either the pitch is turning, and so that's kind of like a high target or a low target, or just anywhere else you think you need to label that to be able to kind of create this pitch contour. The idea behind this is that you don't want to think too hard about why you're putting a tone. Like, you don't want to be thinking, is this an emphasized word? Is this a focus thing? Is this person asking a question? Just label low and high where you hear a low and high. And the only thing you need to be careful for is just make sure that that low and high is actually something that's audible and not something that you're just seeing through a pitch tracking error or something. And this is going to help us later so that we don't just shoehorn every language into a system that looks familiar to us, to maybe our own native language. After you do the landmarks tier, then you put in your words tier and your English tier, meaning a words tier and a kind of translation or glossing. And if possible, if you have access to a grammar that tells you about the accent pattern of the language, you'd also put in the accent marks for the so-called stressed syllables or accented syllables. And you'd want to make sure that you split up orthographic words into separate elements in case the language you're looking at kind of shows compounding through one orthographic word. The last thing you will do then is put in the tones tier. It ends up next to the landmarks tier just for visual niceness, but it should be the last thing you do because that requires a lot of analysis. And that's where you start thinking about how your landmarks line up with your word boundaries or line up with your accent marks for your accent pattern in the language. And that's where you start bringing in a little bit more theory and analysis. So the theory that we're using here is autosegmental metrical theory, which is widely used in a lot of different languages. The general idea that we want to take from this is that the pitch contour is built off of a series of low tones and high tones. So we just write lows and highs or combinations like low-high or high-low if they're kind of rising and falling. And those tones can be of two different types. Either they're pitch accents, meaning they mark an accented syllable, a kind of prominent syllable, or they mark the edge of some kind of unit. The unit could be what we call like an intonation phrase or a phonological phrase, an accentual phrase, whatever kind of label you want to give it. It's just the edge of some kind of unit, some kind of prosodic unit. So just pitch accents and boundary tones. So I've used this word accent a few times, and for those who are not familiar with the term accent, I want to just go over that a little bit. Accent is just a sort of privileged phonological status. It's a privileged status in the sense that that is the kind of syllabic position that might resist phonological neutralization or resist phonetic reduction or maybe attract an intonational tone like a pitch accent. How it's marked phonetically differs across languages. Languages like English put a lot of stress on the accented syllable, whereas languages like maybe Japanese put a specific pitch accent on that syllable, so a particular lexically marked tone, you could say. Or you could mark the accented syllable with both stress and a pitch contour. Either. And neither is shown by French in Lad's typologies. That's on the top right there. And he also, I quote, says, Bengali, probably most of the languages of India, fit under that category of languages where the accented syllable, the special syllable, is not marked by stress or a particular pitch contour, but it's special for other reasons, like hosting more contrast, that sort of thing. We might agree with Ladd's typology with a slight caveat that we would put maybe the quote-unquote tonal South Asian languages in the group with Japanese and Wu Chinese. So Punjabi might go there. So let's finally, now that we're done with some background, we can talk about the data that I've collected. And I want to first talk about how the low tone in the low-high rise is attached to the accented syllable, how we know that. So this low tone at the beginning of the low-high rise, some call it a boundary tone, some call it a pitch accent. And since South Asian languages generally don't have that strong stress marking on the accented syllable, how would we know if this tone is really a pitch accent? Well, we want to start by thinking about which languages have accent that would not be kind of attached to the edge of the word. So there are languages in Hans Henrik Hock's edited volume in his chapter on the phonetics and phonology of South Asian languages. He just has like these 2 really great pages that I would recommend. It's just like within 2 pages, he's able to summarize about the accent patterns of a lot of different South Asian languages, many more than we have data for here. And he finds that, or he reports from all different types of studies that from the Dravidian languages all the way out to Assamese and Nepali and the languages of the Himalayas there, that we see initial accent. So just like a fixed initial stress, you might call it, or accent, that can maybe shift depending on the weight of the second syllable. So it might shift to the second syllable. So I've shown those with green and pink dots, whether it's strictly initial or initial plus weight. And some languages like Bengali and Assamese are described with both patterns depending on which analysis you look at. Nepali is also shown with a number of different analyses. Then there are languages mostly within North and Western India and Pakistan where we see more penultimate stress patterns that are weight sensitive, meaning that, again, that they will move depending on the heaviness of the syllable, but generally it's in the penultimate range. And then there are some languages that are described as maybe even having some limited contrasts in accent marking. So I want to start with these languages with the little blue squares and then the contrastive accent, because we'd want to find languages where the accent is not necessarily on the edge of a word and might be inside the word, and we want to see if the low tone follows it. I'm not going to go through all the details of how to count weight in languages like Hindi and Urdu and whatnot. So I'm just going to go straight to some data from these languages. Here's the 2 examples from Urdu showing a word on the left here, the word muttafik, which has its accent on the first syllable because it's heavy. We see that the low tone is on that first syllable. So we can listen to that over here from the speaker. Muttafik. You can hear that the low tone starts at muttafik, so it starts low on mut. Whereas in the word shimali, which has the accented syllable in the middle, so in the penultimate position, we can hear that that's where the low tone is in this word. Shimali. Shimali, as opposed to having a low at the beginning where it might sound like shimali. So this already is starting to suggest that the low tone is following where the accent is and not necessarily following where the edge of the word is. So we need to first know the accent, and then we'll know where the low tone is going to go. The same thing in the from the Jaipa illustration for Hindi, we see the speaker also has this low tone on the sa in musafir, which is in the penultimate position. Oops, I want to play that. Ek musafir. So we can hear musafir going down on sa and then coming back up for fir. Now, languages like Hindi, Urdu seem to also have this some marginal set of morphemes that can actually attract stress or attract accent. So the causative morpheme is often represented as having a accent attracting property. So we could see that all these 3 words that are visible here, choga, uttarva, and dega, all end in a long a, but only uttarva has the accent on the last syllable because it has that causative morpheme, and that causative morpheme draws the accent. So we can hear that the speaker waits until that last syllable to actually start rising in pitch. Uttarva dega. Uttarva.
उतरवा देगा.
So you can hear that kind of late rise there, suggesting again the low tone is a low pitch accent on that accented syllable. Now, Gujarati is described with some of the same patterns as Hindi Urdu, but we find in our this first speaker of Gujarati that I'm looking at here that the low tone does not necessarily always follow where the heaviest syllable is. So we see that there is not necessarily a penultimate pattern, but maybe an initial kind of pattern. We can see in the word jagarta.
झगड़ता हता.
Again.
झगड़ता हता.
So we can hear that the low tone is on j there. And when there's the causative morpheme, I'm not actually sure if the low tone is on that causative morpheme or the syllable before it. I'm not entirely sure, but either way, that could be a sign for some lexical marking there. So I'll play that.
उड़ावी देशे. उड़ावी देशे.
So I can't tell if it's uravi or uravi. So I can't tell where the low part is. But either way, that's in general, Gujarati seems to have the initial kind of accent. Nepali, which is also described by some analyses as having weight-sensitive accent marking, doesn't seem to reflect that in where the low tone goes. It's always on the first syllable, even on this word like batas, which is described as having the accent on the second syllable.
Uttari batas. Uttari batas.
So that suggests that maybe there's something more complicated going on here, and I'll come back to that in a moment. It seems that at least from data in Hindi and Urdu, that the low always aligns with the accented syllable, even when the accented syllable is not on the left edge. And so the accent pattern is determined by weight and or lexical marking like the causative morpheme. Nepali and Gujarati, however, might be more initial L leaning, with maybe some properties that suggest that they can also shift a little bit too. So now let's look at these other languages that are described as having a strictly initial or possibly weight-sensitive initial pattern. Notice that I have Oriya on here without any dots on it because Hawk does not describe Oriya in his chapter, but we might imagine that given its geographic location between Telugu and Bengali, and also the fact that it's most closely related to Bengali and Assamese, that it might fall within this category of initial or initial plus weight accent. Again, I won't go through the details as to how to determine weight sensitivity in these languages. You can ask me later if you'd like. But what we see in data from, say, Assamese here, that the low generally wants to be on the first syllable, regardless of the weight sensitivity characteristics. So we see that in these two words, even though the second word is described as being heavier on the second syllable, we still see the low on the first syllable.
Uttara bata. Uttara bata.
That's from the Journal of the IPA entry. And also from Malayalam, we see a similar thing where even though we expect that long vowels will count as heavy syllables and possibly shift the accent over from the first to the second syllable, we don't see that in the word for monk here, sannyasi, where we instead see that the low is always on that first syllable.
Bhumil or sannyasi.
So it's sannyasi instead of sannyasi.
Bhumil or sannyasi.
So it seems that, again, the low is not tracking exactly where the heavy syllable is. It's tracking just whatever is the first syllable. And Oriya, which was not described before by Hawk at least, it seems to be, as expected, within this category that looks like Bengali, Assamese, and whatnot, where the first syllable has the low, even when the second syllable is heavier. So in this word birokta, we see that the rok has a closed syllable and would be expected to be heavier, and yet it's the bi that has the low tone.
Jatri birakta.
Again.
Jatri birakta.
All right, so to summarize what we've seen there, in Dravidian languages, and at least in most Indo-Aryan languages, it seems that the low is in a fixed initial position, and it seems to be ignoring the weight of different syllables. And there doesn't seem to be any kind of lexical marking like we saw with the causative morpheme in Hindi Urdu. So there's maybe two interpretations here. One interpretation is that, well, this is not an accent. The low is just a boundary tone and it's attracted to the first syllable because it's near the edge. So that would be a kind of AL interpretation, meaning it's a low tone that's on the left edge of an accentual phrase. The other a reason why we might not want to go that way, though, is that would suggest accent is just not a thing in these languages, or not a thing within the intonational system of these languages. That seems a little bit odd, that there is this, accent that's been described, and yet it plays no role in the intonation. That seems a little bit odd. Another way to think about it is that maybe it is a pitch accent and it is attracted to the accented syllable, but maybe the accented syllable is just in some ways the first syllable, maybe in a different way than the weight-sensitive accent pattern that's described in other studies. So if we say that this is a pitch accent, which we don't have to necessarily do, this is only one interpretation, we might want to look for evidence that that first syllable has some kind of specialness, some kind of evidence of it being phonologically accented. And at least some detailed descriptions of both Tamil and Bengali suggest that that is the case. So in Tamil, we see that the initial syllable is the only one that can host the vowel length contrast for mid-vowels. It's the only syllable where we can see that nasal place assimilation is resisted, and we can maintain nasal contrast there. And the I, U, A, the short I, U, and A resist centralization in initial syllables, suggesting that there's some kind of special status for that syllable. In Bengali as well, we see that there's more contrasts that are preserved there, and even words from other languages that have non-initial stress patterns can be truncated so that they kind of fit the Bengali style initial accent. So the word like American in English can be truncated as markin, so that we still have the accent on mar, and assalamu alaikum from Arabic is usually pronounced salam alaikum with just sla as the initial syllable there. So considering this, and maybe considering some transparency issues across South Asian languages, we might suggest that that first low is generally an accent, but keeping reservations that maybe in some languages it behaves more like a boundary tone than a pitch accent. So then we can take this more complicated map of South Asia and the many different analyses of accent pattern types, and maybe reduce it if we use the low tone position as an indicator of what the accent pattern is. So with respect to where the low goes, maybe it's actually just that most South Asian languages have an initial accent pattern all the way from the Dravidian languages through Gujarati and all the way to the Northeast. And only a minority of languages, including Hindi, Urdu, and Sindhi, will have the kind of penultimate pattern with some marginal kind of contrast involving like the causative morpheme. All right, so next I'd like to talk about the alignment of the high tone. We'll see that the kind of typical pattern that's described in the literature is that the high tone is always on the right edge of the prosodic unit we're talking about. So some people say the word, some people say the essential phrase or the phonological phrase, but it's always on the right edge. And in fact, that high tone is a really useful diagnostic for prosodic structure if you follow that kind of line of reasoning. So if you find the highest pitch within a particular range, you might think that that could be the domain of a segmental process, like R assimilation or R dropping within Bengali and Assamese respectively, or maybe to find kind of like evidence for syntactic phrasing to show like how prosody can disambiguate syntactic phrasing. So we'd want to know exactly where that high is and what it means. So here's like a typical case from Assamese where even like, these two words together, these two verbs are kind of grouped together within one accentual phrase, and the high ends up at the end of it, providing this really beautiful long stretch of rising pitch, as well as this Sanskritic word for obliged, and then being compounded with the verb for become, also forming a really nice kind of long stretch of rising pitch. So we can listen to that. You can hear that the speaker really does have an evenly rising pitch across both of those elements.
মানি লবলৈ বাধ্য হল
So mani loboloi and baidhyo hol. So again.
মানি লবলৈ বাধ্য হল.
So that would be the typical case, but occasionally researchers have mentioned that there's a kind of mysteriously early realization of the high that doesn't necessarily line up with where you'd expect a word boundary or prosodic unit boundary to be. Instead, that high seems to immediately follow whatever is the syllable with the low, regardless of how far away that is from the word edge. And that's described at least for Bengali in my own work, as well as Tamil in Eleanor Keene's work from 2014. And both she and I have proposed that possibly the low star high might be a way to interpret such examples where we see that the high seems to hug close to the pitch accent and not near the boundary tone. That might mean that what we were calling the repetitive rising contour might be actually a conflation of at least two different structures. One where there's a low on the accent and a high on the right edge, and another where there's a low and a high, both kind of right around the accent, where the low ends up on the accent and the high a little bit right after. And since many different intonational studies, my own included, usually look a lot at disyllabic stems with initial accent, just because they're so common in South Asian languages, that makes it impossible to distinguish these two types of structures. So if we look at longer stems, we'd want to really pay attention to where that high ends up. So here's an example of a low star high, with low star meaning the low on the accented syllable and a high immediately following it. So peaking usually at the end of the second syllable, persisting maybe a little bit into the third syllable. We see that in this first word, অবশেষে. So let's listen to the speaker here.
অবশেষে উত্তর হাওয়া মেনে নিতে বাধ্য হলো।
So over here, we're seeing that this word, which is morphologically complex, but doesn't have more than one stem in it, I would say, অবশেষে reaches its height kind of between the second and third syllable. So somewhere around there, I can't tell exactly where the highest point is because there's a fricative kind of in between there. But either way, we see that that's where the height is and not necessarily only at the end of the word. In these other examples of low star followed by high, there's also a word boundary there, so I'm not as confident about those ones, but definitely about that first word there. In other languages like Tamil, it's even more common and even more convincing because of where the high ends up. So we see in this example for adu pandayathile, so we can listen to that.
அது பந்தயத்துல
This word pandayathile is morphologically complex, but the root of it is pandayam, where the first three syllables should be part of the root there. And yet the high is ending up really on the second syllable, suggesting that it's not occurring at any kind of edge or anything like that. It really is just on the syllable after the accented syllable pan. And we see it also in this gatum over here.
காத்தும் சூரியனும்
We see that really strong rising on the first syllable gat.
காத்தும் சூரியனும்
And then it kind of starts petering out from there. It's not exactly as high at the end. In Tamil, it seems like it's not necessarily the second syllable where the high ends up, but the second vocalic mora. So it matters if you're looking at a short vowel or a long vowel. So you can see in pandayatile with all short vowels, the high part is on the second syllable. But in katum, because that starts with a long vowel, the high ends up on that first syllable. If you're curious about where the high of a low star high can end up, it seems that in the languages that have this low star high, it's generally in the second syllable. So we see that in the Eastern Indo-Aryan languages, as well as in Sindhi and Malayalam. And in the other three Dravidian languages, Kannada, Tamil, and Telugu, we see that there's maybe the vowel length plays a role. And so it might be on the second mora or the third mora, the second vocalic mora or the third vocalic mora. In Gujarati, Hindi, and Urdu, at least in the data that I've seen so far, there's not necessarily any evidence that there is a low star high in those languages, but it's also harder to get such long words there that with an accent far from the word edge. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is that it's not true that we only have low-high contours in South Asian languages. In fact, we see a lot of other kinds of contours, some of which you could imagine are types of rises. I call them late rises and early rises. So we can see that they involve a sort of medial tone. They start low and end high, but they have another low in the middle or another high in the middle. And we also see some contours that involve falls. So kind of rise fall, a fall rise, and a double rise. And I'll come back to these images in a moment. So I'm just going to go through and get first to the late rises and the early rises. Late rises are, as they sound, they have a rising pattern, but they just begin that rise later in the word than expected. So they still have a low on the accented first syllable, and then on the last syllable, that's where you start seeing the rise up. So it seems to be that there's some kind of medial tone, a kind of pre-final low that we're kind of waiting for the end of each AP, each accentual phrase. So we have an example here. Late rises.
उही नै बोलियो मानिनेछ उही नै बोलियो मानिनेछ
So if I'm not listening like not super carefully, it sounds just like your usual rise. But if I listen very carefully, then maybe I can tell that on the last syllable there really is that kind of extra rise.
उही नै बोलियो मानिनेछ
Uhinai balio maninisa. In Assamese, it's very common to have this kind of late rise there, so we can hear that in multiple positions here.
সিমান দূৰেৰে নিজৰ চোলাটো মেৰিয়াই
So it's not zurere, but zurere, where we kind of like get that rise at the end of it. So we can hear that again.
সিমান দূৰেৰে নিজৰ চোলাটো মেৰিয়াই
And in Malayalam, it's also fairly common. So we can listen to, even in this fairly short word, mele, we can see that the speaker kind of still waits until the last possible minute to start rising. So we can hear that kind of like prolongation of a sort of plateau or kind of low stretch and then a rise at the end. And in Podappu, it's even more noticeable because maybe we have one more syllable. And so it's more noticeable that we drop and then rise at the end. Now, this late rise might just be a free variant of the direct rise. There seems to be a variation within a language, even within a speaker, even within a sentence. So it seems like maybe it's not something that's all that meaningful. And fortunately for us, if you're interested in where the H is, because you want to know where the end of the phrase is, that H is still going to be at the end. So that's going to be okay no matter what with this late rise. So maybe this is just a free variant, but I'm labeling it differently just in case it might have different, it might convey a different meaning for native speakers of the language. The early rise, however, is a little bit different. Obviously, it starts earlier, so the rise begins immediately after the accented syllable, and we know we can do that with the low star high accent. So we're going to get a high in the second syllable, or the second vocalic mora, or the third vocalic mora, depending on the language. And then either there's a sort of prolongation of that high, or we see a slight fall after that high to the high boundary tone. So let's listen to that in Oriya. So this speaker of Oriya uses this particular contour almost always, almost like throughout. Whenever there's more than two syllables involved, the second syllable is already very high and then kind of flattens out or falls by the last syllable. Now that last little fall, it doesn't fall all the way to a low, but it falls just to a not so high, and that could be an issue if you're looking for the high tone at the end. It's also found in Tamil and other Dravidian languages.
காத்தும்
So you can
சூரியனும்
hear that, rise up in kat, as we heard earlier.
காத்தும் சூரியனும்
Now, again, this might be just a variant of the direct rise, so maybe it's not that meaningful to point out the difference. There's variation within language, within speaker, within a sentence. But it might be useful to label this differently, or at least pay attention to it, because the high is on a different syllable than you would have expected if you're looking for edges of prosodic units being marked by a high tone. Since the highest high tone tends to be closer to the accent in these examples, it might suggest that if you weren't paying attention, you might think that these units are a lot shorter than they actually are. So you might not want your analysis to be affected by that. In terms of the geographic kind of prevalence of these tones, we see that early rises and late rises are very common across this like Dravidian through northeast stretch that I keep pointing out, shows a lot of similarities, whereas Urdu, Hindi, Gujarati, and Sindhi are separate in the sense that they don't really have either of these patterns as an option. Either because, like Urdu and Hindi, they might have other kinds of alternative patterns, similarly in Sindhi, or it could be more like Gujarati, where we just have a real preference for the direct rise from low to high. In terms of who prefers later rises and who prefers earlier rises, it at least seems like the later rises are more typical in Assamese, Nepali, and Malayalam, and the other languages within this stretch prefer the earlier rise if they're going to use one or the other. And I wanted to talk about some of these contours that involve falls, which of course would be very different from the typical low-high pattern that we just have described so far. This rise fall that has a low star high, so we already know how we're going to get that. We're going to get that through a pitch accent that has a low on the accented syllable and a high afterwards, can be followed by a low boundary tone. So this low, high, low is fairly common in Tamil. So we can listen to it, this entire phrase here.
கம்பளியை எடுக்க வைக்கிறாங்களோ
So we can hear in the kambaliye. I just want to listen to just that word. You can hear it.
கம்பளியை எடுக்க வைக்கிறாங்களோ
Oops, sorry.
கம்பளியை கம்பளியை
So you can hear that it falls by kambaliye. It kind of goes down. And it's Sindhi has a slightly different version of this sort of pattern, where in Sindhi, because they have a later accent pattern, a sort of penultimate type accent pattern, that means that the accented syllable could be in penultimate or antepenultimate position, and instead of the low being on that accented syllable, we see the high on that syllable and the low before it. This creates a very different kind of percept, for me at least, compared to the other languages that we've been listening for, because we rise up to the accented syllable and then start falling, which is the exact reverse of what we've been talking about in the other languages. So we'll listen to that.
The Jeko Musafir jo coat. The Jeko Musafir jo coat.
So in that way, it sounds a lot like the English kind of like high falling accent on the accented syllable. But what's different from English is, of course, there are these boundary tones on the edges of all the different words or accentual phrases. So again, I'll play that.
The Jeko Musafir jo coat.
Fall rises are something that I've only seen so far in Urdu and maybe marginally in the speaker for the Hindi illustration. But my speakers from who speak Urdu from Pakistan have a lot of these types of fall rises where they fall into the pitch accented syllable and then rise after that. So the kind of second half of it is expected. We are rising from the accented syllable. But before the accented syllable, we see a sharp drop, even when that's within a particular word. So we see that musafir and utarne, both of these words have the accent in the middle of the word, so it's on the penultimate syllable. We see a sharp drop into that accented syllable and then a rise after that. So the speaker again speaks very fast, so I want you to pay attention to just the ismusafir ki and utarne me, which she's going to say a lot faster than me.
जो इस मुसाफिर की चादर उतारने में जो इस मुसाफिर की चादर उतारने में
So she's like, Jo is musafir ki chadar utarne mein. So the utarne and musafir are great examples of falling into the accented syllable and then rising afterwards. It's really obvious when this happens at the beginning of a phrase as well. So we can see that here the same word musafir is showing up at the beginning of the overall sentence. And so there's no preceding word that we can kind of blame for this high tone. It's the high tone is kind of part of this pitch accent for musafir. So we can hear that again here with musafir ne pareshan hokar.
मुसाफिर ने परेशान होकर
So she falls just into those particular syllables.
मुसाफिर ने परेशान होकर
Now, the last kind of pattern I want to talk about is the double rise, which is characteristic in a lot of Dravidian languages, including, or in the Dravidian languages that I'm looking at, including Tamil. So we see this kind of rise for the accented syllable and then another rise at the end of that phrase.
காத்தும் சூரியனும்
So katum, so kind of like rise on that. And in this speaker of Kannada is a big fan of this particular double rise and uses it on almost every word, even words that are just 2 syllables long. So you can hear this word sotu that she says with a double rise.
ಕೊನೆಗೆ ಗಾಳಿಯು ಸೋತು ಸುಮ್ಮನಾಯಿತು
It's like konege, galiu, sotu. So each one has the double rise there. Now, we don't want to go too far with that. We don't want to assume we see double rises everywhere, because sometimes we might be influenced by the orthography. For example, in Malayalam, typically the compound words are going to be written as a single word. So the word for north wind, it will be written as one word, and you might see a kind of double rise across that. But don't let that confuse you, in the sense that the intonation might still reflect that there are sort of 2 words in there, at least 2 accentual phrases in there. You can see in this example of north and wind that the high tone that's appearing in the middle is appearing right exactly where a word boundary would be if we were to think of this as 2 separate words, whereas it should have been earlier if this were actually a low plus high and then a low high at the end. We might have imagined like vada and then starting to fall after that. But here we see that the high is at the end of the word for north.
വടക്കൻ കാറ്റും
The speaker has a very narrow pitch range, but you can still sort of hear that there's a rise across each word, ending on the third syllable of Varakan and the second of. All right, so we've seen a pretty South Asian languages, and we can maybe distinguish them based on where the high is with respect to where the accent is. So in a lot of languages from Assamese through Malayalam, we see that if there's going to be a high involved around the accent, it's going to be after the accent. So we say it trails the accent. In Sindhi, we see that the high is on the accent. So that's shown in purple, or pink, magenta, whatever. Whereas in our speakers from Urdu, we see that the accent, the high leads the accent, so it appears just before the accented syllable. Whereas in Hindi and Gujarati, I didn't really see a lot of examples of a high being involved with pitch accents, so I can't say much about that. So it seems like there's a sort of geographic pattern going on, where as we move north and west, the languages tend to be more weight sensitive, they have more contrastive elements in terms of accent placement, at least with a causative marker, and they may have an earlier H, earlier high in the pitch accent. But as we move further south and further east, we see a more fixed accent pattern at the initial position. We see a kind of a later H in the complex pitch accent and a less of a reliance on that default high boundary tone. Okay, so the last pattern I'm going to cover, which will be super fast, is just to mention one more type of structure that a tone can be attracted to in a South Asian language. And that only happens so far, from what I can tell, in Telugu, which is really interesting. In autosegmental metrical theory, you remember that tones can only attach to accented syllables or edges of phrases. But in Telugu, it seems like there can also be a type of tone that is attracted to a long vowel, even when it's not in either of these positions. So what we see in examples like Bata Sari for the traveler over there is that we see a rise across the first two syllables of Bata as expected for Telugu, because there's going to be a rising pattern there. And then we would expect that either that pitch would stay flat and high if we have a high boundary tone, or would start falling if we have a low boundary tone. But what we see instead is it stays high up until the long vowel of the penultimate syllable and then starts falling, as though there's a high-low kind of sequence that's required there. And we don't see that in the word afterwards, dalasari, which doesn't have a long vowel in it. We just see a rise and fall. Gambali, again, has that prolongation of a high tone. It seems as though, I'm not sure if it's an extension of the pitch accent or an extension back from the boundary tone, but this high target on the long vowel seems to be something specific to Telugu. It's most characteristic of this particular speaker, who's the speaker for the Journal of the IPA entry, but also is found in other speakers from the archives. So this would be something pretty new for AM theory. All right, so I want to start wrapping up. Is there a typical South Asian language intonation? What does it mean to have no contrastive tone and just a weak accent? And what do South Asian languages bring to intonational theory? Well, first of all, yeah, there is a typical South Asian language intonation. In a very basic sense, we can say that accent placement is generally not a contrastive element of South Asian languages for the most part. Generally, accent is not marked with a very strong audible stress or lexical tone, again, generally, with exceptions. And generally, with exceptions, words are going to bear rising contours. But beyond these general characteristics, we see lots of exceptions and complicated sub-patterns. So that low tone at the beginning of the rise might be marking an edge, might be marking an accent. Sometimes it's hard to tell. The high might be marking an edge, or might be coming right after the accent, or it could be hard to tell. The accent might be marginally contrastive in some languages of the North and the West. And there are lots of alternative patterns, especially as we move further south and east, when we get those medial tones and lots of complicated boundary tones. So instead of just having a low pitch accent and high boundary tone that we see in most models of South Asian languages, we might expand into lots of different pitch accents and boundary tones. We haven't even started talking about boundary tones of larger elements, and we won't have time today, but that could be for, of course, future thoughts. And to that second question, the kind of big question of what does it mean that South Asian languages have no contrastive tone and only weak accent? What does that do to the intonation of such languages? Well, it means that we see a lot of variability within and across languages in terms of the tonal inventory and how frequent certain types of tones are used. There's not just one set pattern, and yet there's not a total freedom necessarily. We still see that there is a kind of reliance on morphosyntactic structure, kind of like word boundaries, these kinds of prosodic units that kind of align with word boundaries or something roughly like that, that still can structure the intonational contour. So that might be the kind of one of the special things about South Asia, in addition to a kind of growing understanding of what Caroline Ferry calls the phrase languages. Mongolian and Greenlandic and Korean might also fit under this category of languages that where the accent doesn't play as strong of a role, but the edges of units play a much stronger role. Even in the languages that have accent in South Asia, it's often at an edge anyway. And so we really do see that kind of phrasal component there. And only in a subset of Indo-Aryan languages do we see that the accent might be strong enough to actually be away from that phrase edge. In terms of what new kinds of phenomena that South Asian languages are contributing to what we know about intonation, well, first of all, there's a lot more variability in how tones are aligned. AM theory assumes that tones have to be either pitch accents or boundary tones. They can't just switch back and forth between these two. And yet we see that within even the same South Asian language that sometimes the L behaves more like a boundary tone, sometimes it behaves more like a pitch accent, sometimes the high behaves more like a boundary tone, sometimes the high behaves like part of the pitch accent, or both. And even when we talk about that low star high reaching the end of the second syllable, maybe we could still think of how that is sort of like boundary tones for a foot or some kind of smaller structure that usually is not, that's usually ignored within intonational theory because it's kind of smaller than a word. There's also the interesting data from Telugu telling us that long vowels might also be another kind of attracting structure for tones. That since that long vowel is neither an accented syllable nor at an edge, it seems to be a new kind of structure that we want to incorporate within AM theory. There's also possibly language specific or within language variation that I haven't been able to talk about, but you can ask me about it if you're interested. We see that different speakers of Kannada, for example, seem to show different patterns for not just accent placement, but also the preference for different kinds of pitch accents on those accents. We've also not talked about any languages outside of Indo-Aryan and Dravidian. And some of the work that's been done recently by Ferry and Fancelov have found that maybe at least some Tibeto-Burman languages do have the same kind of repeating rising contours that are described for Indo-Aryan and Dravidian languages. We do want to also see how lexical tone would be incorporated in such a model, because languages like Sylheti or Punjabi or Bodo, which have lexical tone, but also are described as having a sort of rising pattern, we'd want to see how those interact with one another. And hopefully we'll get more and more data from these languages to kind of help tease that, to find out exactly what's going on there. All right, so I'm going to end here just to, in the interest of time, I want to thank Shakuntala and Indranil, Shomdev, Amalesh, and Renu once again for organizing IndoPhon. I want to thank everybody here in the audience and around the world for attending and for the questions that I hope to see soon, as well as everybody who's been involved in the project in one way or the other. I want to thank you all. So I'll stop sharing there.
So thanks a lot, Samir. Now we'll take some questions. And thanks a lot for a great talk. And we have a lot of appreciation for your talk here in the comments. Hopefully we'll share some. And so I will go with the questions as they have come in. So there's some questions relating to, are they native speakers? So I answered on behalf of you because most of them are JIPA language descriptions, right? So, and they are native speakers. So do you want to add anything to that? Yeah.
Right. So it's true. I mean, they're all native speakers of these different languages, but that doesn't mean necessarily that they're monolingual speakers. And so that is definitely something to take into account. Intonation is definitely one of those things that is very closely tied to one's personal kind of identification. So if somebody is a speaker of multiple languages, they might bring in some intonation from one language or one of their native languages to another, depending on the context and whatnot. So there is, of course, that to keep in mind, that the speaker of Kannada that I showed just a moment ago has a lot of possibly Hindi influence in her intonation. And so that's something to also consider.
So there are many more questions, so we will quickly address them. There's another one from Priti. So are there no major acoustic cues involved in stress prominence in phonological words in non-tonal South Asian languages? So do you want to take that?
That's a really good question. Yeah. There have been a lot of people who have looked into this to see if there are acoustic correlates for what are described as the accented or possibly stressed syllables, if there really is audible stress in South Asian languages. And generally, we find that, not that I know the entire literature on this, but from what I've seen in the literature is that people kind of give up and say, like, we can't really use intensity or duration necessarily. It depends on the language, of course. Some languages that have vowel length contrasts might kind of accentuate those length contrasts under accent. Some languages might also be able to use the kind of acoustic space of the vowel space and use more peripheral pronunciation of a vowel that's under accent versus not. So those things are definitely pointed out, but intensity is not a really good measure for South Asian language stress accent. And when you look at pitch, there are definitely those studies that have looked for high pitch on stress syllables, kind of thinking about English, and they find that it's not a good cue. But of course, it's because probably we want to look for low pitch. But yeah, so there might be some acoustic correlates, but they might also be highly language specific and highly even speaker specific or context specific. And so I've tried to abstract away from that in looking at this as a phonological model. But that's a great question.
So there are more questions about recordings, but at least Jipa recordings are all native speakers, right? So they are mostly, at least for Assamese, I can say they're all taken in Assam and, in the special district. So we have to identify the speaker and where that person is from, where that person grew up. So Jipa, things are very easy to follow up. So I think, and the others that you had, did you have any non-Jipa recordings?
Yeah, there are some that I recorded at Reed College, and also some that were from the socially distanced, kind of like, people self-recording. The self-recording ones were, again, like all from native speakers, but not necessarily in situ in South Asia. They could be elsewhere. But the people that I recorded at Reed College, they were all international students who had just come to Reed College from having grown up in South Asia. So they were not born and raised in the US like I would be, and accent, heavily influenced by English.
So there is this question, not a question, it's a comment, I think. Malayalam accents seem not to be typical of the Dravidian languages. And but Kannada and Telugu, the pattern won't be the same here.
Yeah, that's a really good observation. I also was surprised. I was just kind of expecting that all the Dravidian languages would have the same kind of pattern, but that was maybe an incorrect bias on my part, thinking that would be the case. And it seems that in many different situations, Malayalam behaves differently from the other three Dravidian languages that I was looking at. And that's looking across different speakers too. So it's not just one individual speaker who was kind of driving those differences. So yeah, I'm not sure exactly. I see.
He's interested in typological similarities in.
Yeah, it's possible that there could be the influence of individual words that are used. Now, all those different languages that we looked at had a lot of Sanskritic borrowings and other Indo-Aryan borrowings in the recordings. So it's not just that only Malayalam had a lot of Indo-Aryan or something, lexical items. They appeared in a number of the languages, and yet it was really only Malayalam that behaved differently in terms of a lot of these kinds of patterns.
So it's a question on downstep.
Yeah, so that's a great question, Yadav. So yes, downstep is definitely a component in these languages, in that each accentual phrase is a little bit lower than the preceding accentual phrase in the typical pattern, so that all those rising contours are also kind of like stepping down towards the end of the utterance. There can be exceptions to that based on a number of things. For example, function words will not reach the same height that a content word will. So if a content word is followed or is preceded by a function word, the function word might not necessarily have a higher high than the content word. And also focus can get into, can kind of mess with this as well. When you have a focused element, we see an expansion of the pitch range, and you kind of see a violation of downstep there. So I tried to avoid talking about that just because it gets more complicated, and I just wanted to talk about the shape of the contour, but it's true that the relative height from one contour to the next is also something to look at.
So compound and reduplication.
Ooh, this is a great question. There are examples of reduplication that ended up in the North Wind recordings, as well as in the more spontaneous recordings from the frog story. So especially when people use the words for like immediately, like shonge shonge, or that type of word, we can see that usually the first half of the reduplicated element has the kind of full expression of the low to high, and the second part, the reduplicant part, seems to be a little bit more compressed, even more compressed than you would expect from downstep. So that's kind of an interesting pattern that we see. And I didn't get to show that in the data here, but that's true across a lot of different languages. And there's also the opposite
like words,
possibility.
right? With slight difference there.
Yeah, compound words
Compounds,
can be merged together or kept
Yeah.
separately. Yeah, so compound words, like the reduplicated elements, they can appear as one AP and just have a single kind of rise or a single kind of pattern across the whole element, or they can be broken up into two elements, but still the second half kind of looks like it sort of is subservient to the first half, in the sense that the first half gets the full expression of the contour and the second half gets a kind of attenuated version of the same contour.
So there is a humorous comment that there's some memes that you could follow for the Musafir example.
Okay, I'm gonna write that down. I don't know the meme,
so Yashraj Mukhate's memes on Rasora.
Okay, I'll take a look at that.
Yeah. So, and there is a question from Professor Hemlata Nagarajan. Is this pattern transferred to loan words as well?
So the loan words I've seen, other than the ones that are kind of incorporated loan words that are in the North Wind story. So of course, there's a lot of Sanskritic words and whatnot in there. If you're thinking more about loan words from English and kind of words that people are more aware are coming from another language, there are a few of those in the frog story. A lot of people don't know, how to translate deer or owl, or a number of, or even different kinds of trees. So they use a lot of English words, and in those cases, I have seen that they still kind of have the intonation of the language of study. So they don't necessarily look like they're switching into English intonation and then coming back out. But one thing that I would want to look for, which I don't have enough data to really do a thorough check on, is whether the accent pattern of the English word is preserved in the language, even if the language has like a strict initial pattern or something like that. So that would be something interesting to see how much kind of gets taken in.
So, there was a question on boundary tones. So I specified and asked if it's about boundary tones in South Asian languages. But I think you have already talked quite a bit about boundary tones. So wants you to speak about boundary tones. I don't know.
I think I can say a little something.
Yes.
So I've talked a lot about the boundary tones of the accentual phrases, so the kind of smaller phrases, and I haven't been able to talk about the larger boundary tones that end up at the end of the overall intonation phrase. The kind of boundary tones that convey this is a statement versus this is a question, or this is a continuation rise, those types of boundary tones. And of course, those tones are going to be different across different languages, and so there's not going to be a lot of things I can say that apply to all of the languages that I've been looking at. But one thing that I can point out is that there is a general tendency to replace the accentual phrase boundary tone with the intonation phrase boundary tone. So let's say every accentual phrase in a language usually ends on a high. That high is kind of deleted and replaced with a low or a low high or some other kind of intonation phrase tone. So we say that there's some kind of boundary tone overriding, that the intonation phrase boundary tone overrides the boundary tones of the accentual phrase or other kind of smaller phrases. So that seems to be true from all the different languages I looked at. No matter what their inventory of boundary tones is, they have the overriding characteristic.
So so Professor Preeti Rao
Great
asks, how does
question.
this
Yeah.
information? Yeah.
Yeah, so I've ignored talking about focus for this particular talk, but it's really an interest of mine, looking mostly at Bengali itself and the focus in Bengali, which seems to be even within the language. So what we know is that focus marking can arise in a lot of different ways. Even I would have assumed that Bengali and Hindi would look really similar in their focus marking, but actually they appear very different looking at different studies. So in Bengali, we see that focus marking can arise in the sense that instead of using the low pitch accent and high boundary tone, speakers might prefer the low star high, the kind of rising boundary tone, rising pitch accent, and change the boundary tone or remove it entirely. That could mark focus to have the high come a little bit earlier. Whereas in Hindi, it seems like maybe the scaling of the different elements is really what's telling you what's focused. And not even the scaling of the focused element, but a scaling of what's not focused, usually what's post-focal, that seems to be highly compressed. And that's really the main marker of something being focused in a South Asian language. So that's kind of interesting and something to look for, which is how much of it is a change in the tonal structure or tonal positions or choices, and how much of it is just a scaling difference that marks whether something is focused or not focused.
So Olga Maxwell asked the questions on whether it's read speech or spontaneous speech. We started looking at spontaneous speech.
Yeah, the speech that we looked at here, of course, is all read speech from the North Wind passage, but there is also the frog story, which is not exactly spontaneous in the sense that people are, telling a story from a book. So it's, they've been told to do something. It's, they know they're in the lab and whatnot, but they're not reading a pre-recorded text in any type of form. So it's more spontaneous in that sense, that they're not maybe overtly influenced by the orthography of the language or whether there's punctuation marks, that sort of thing. But I don't have data that would be truly spontaneous. And I'm not sure how that would look different, but I would like to look at that.
That's always a problem, right? Yeah.
It's a much harder to collect and much harder to analyze.
Because what will you compare with if you have a spontaneous, that has been my problem, that I cannot collect spontaneous data from different people, and they're all different then too. I don't have any way of comparing them. So again, I think you had answered this question, but so is there any work on downstep pitch scaling in South Asian languages in the LAD sense?
Okay, so if it's in the sense of like a phonetic downdrift, where there's a sort of like the actual scaling changes over the time over the course of the sentence. I personally am not familiar with a study that has looked at that kind of quantitatively and seeing if there's like a way to predict how much downstep you should see and what would count as a violation of that. For me, it's just been, is it perceptually higher or lower than the preceding high, and I haven't really done it in terms of like predicting what would be the expected downstep scaling.
Oh, sorry, I took that off. But yeah, so so there's a lot of appreciation for your talk. So we know him from Linguistics Twitter. So and AM theory, I guess. Do you want to? I guess.
Yeah, I mean, we could have long talks about what AM theory is. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it'd be useful to look at Bob Ladd's work. I think Bob Ladd's Intonational Phonology is a useful introduction, or maybe even going to Sana Jan's prosodic typology edited volumes, because there's a good kind of introduction to how AM theory looks, at least across in different languages. But the general ideas would be that, we look at the pitch contour not as a series of shapes or but instead of a series of targets. So it's not that we have a rising shape necessarily, but we build that through a sequence of a low target and then a high target. So that's kind of like one important concept. And another one is that we don't have like 20 different levels of low and high, that we just have low and we have high. And those are the underlying kinds of underlying targets that then get phonetically implemented into maybe a slightly lower high or a slightly higher low based on how these tones interact with each other and with the segments. So those are those kind of like general ways that AM theory tries to pull back from the phonetic details and kind of phonologize or like find a phonological analysis of the pitch contour that way.
So head final, would you look at head? But someone says that Khasi is a head medial language. So I don't know.
Right. I mean,
the
point still stands, though. That's true. I mean, all these languages that I'm looking at have the same kind of syntactic structure in that sense. So like maybe that could be also influencing how the intonation comes out. I wouldn't have a prediction as to how it would look different in a head initial language or a V2 language like Kashmiri or something like that. But it's true that I should incorporate such languages to really see how much carries over. But I think Khasi would also be really interestingly different for other reasons beyond even being head initial or head medial, whatever we'd call it.
Yeah. So there is a question again on contrastive stress, and I think you answered that question. So and contrastive stress and intonation. So I think we will skip this. We'll come back to it because there are quite a few other questions also. I'm just skipping the ones that you have already sort of answered. So here is a question on Maithili. So Maithili is very interesting, but I haven't seen any work on intonation in Maithili.
No, I haven't either. So that's a really, really great point. I'll look into Maithili because I'm not as familiar with the intonation of Maithili or any of the languages that are grouped under Bihari. So I would like to see how those map.
They seem to stand apart from Hindi, and that's something I was thinking about as well. Yeah. So and then apparently Professor KP Mohanan has some questions. So where do we find the questions? So before Professor Mohanan asks his questions, let me. I don't have a question, but I wanted to make a comment. So I think you have shown the Assamese Jipa and the Nepali, so Uttar Bota, and what I did a long time back was I sort of showed that if the second syllable is heavy, then the rise is not very so the canonical LH, so that you see in Assamese that the H is always goes towards the boundary. That is always lowered a bit, which we saw again in both Batas in Nepali and also Bota in Assamese. I think not in Uttar, but in Bota it was it's still a rise, but the rise is a bit low than the what you normally see. So
so would you say that that would be like a that the tone is actually associated to that second syllable then, and it's a different tone, maybe like a low high star, or
that's why my contention was that was the phonological point that I had made, that even though it's a rise, the rise is not as high as the that you see in open syllables.
Great, thank you. I will be
but I don't know how consistently you would see that, but in both Assamese Homia Bota and in Nepali Batas, I could see it again. So there are work on downstep in Thado tonal. Okay, I think it is somebody. I think Professor KP Mohanan has questions. I can't see them, so I think maybe Renu, can you ask Professor Mohanan to somehow tell us the questions, or we'll have to wrap up the session because Samir has already answered so many questions, and we have to make a
it's
few.
okay.
Yeah. So, does it affect his? Okay, so there's a question here. I think this is from Professor Mohanan.
Yeah, this is really a great point, which is that there is independent evidence for stress, weight-sensitive stress in Malayalam, which is, obviously from your work and many others who have cited you have demonstrated that there is this difference. And I guess what I'm curious about it, and what I would want to explore more, is to see how much that lines up with exactly what the these intonational tones. Now, it might mean that the intonational tones just have not then the just boundary tones, the way Fairy would suggest. That could be one analysis. Or maybe it's kind of what Shakuntala is saying for Assamese, where there is still a low star maybe on that first syllable, but it's realized differently when the second syllable is heavy, and that is how we mark that second syllable as being stress accented. So that would be a really interesting thing to look at, and maybe once I have more data from Malayalam across different speakers and different types of words, I would like to see exactly what the realization of that rise is across different weight patterns. But yeah, I mean, it surprised me. I really did expect to see that the low would just move over to the second syllable, but it's not as simple as that. It's probably more of a complicated thing that, like Shakuntala said, for Assamese. That's my guess, at least.
So thank you very much. We have a lot of appreciation again coming in from everyone. I would like to end the session with thanking everyone who participated, for the questions, for attending the talk. It was it was an amazing talk for all of us, because we have learned so much about South Asian languages, irrespective of language groups, and hope to see more work like that from Samir. And anybody who's interested in collaborating with Samir, please write to him. You have the email there. And a couple of announcements that I would like to make is that we are providing some student support, very minimal, but to the extent that's possible, we'll try to provide data cards to students who really need them or do not have any support from their institutions. And we will, based on the registrations, we will get back to you about that. And also the other announcement is that please subscribe to our YouTube channel and like, subscribe, comment, and so and we look forward to having you in our forthcoming talks. The next one is on 12th October by Professor Preeti Rao. And thank you again for your comments and appreciating our efforts. Thank you. So with this, I will end up my broadcast, and also please appreciate all our colleagues there, Professor Indranil Datta, Professor Somdev Kar, Professor Renu Punoz, and Professor Amalesh Gop, because today I'm moderating this, but all the work behind this is going on, day in and day out, relentlessly. So thank you, everyone, again, and I'll end this broadcast. But yeah.
Thank you all.